Hello and welcome to the Domestic Abuse Risk Assessment and Referral Pathway Training. My name is Jane Hardy and I am an Area Manager for You First. I currently cover domestic abuse services in the Hampshire, Isle of Wight and West Sussex area. I have worked within the domestic abuse sector since 2012 and have managed frontline services. I'm also a Safe Lives Accredited Service Manager, a MARAC Chair. I facilitate the DA Matters training for frontline police officers and the DASH Masterclass for domestic abuse practitioners.
Hi, my name is Katie Bielek and I'm the Area Manager West for You First, covering Dorset and Somerset, and I manage the domestic abuse services and also the stalking service in Dorset. My history is I was a police officer for 5 years in Metropolitan Police, covering Greenwich and then Hammersmith and Fulham. I then worked alongside probation, supporting victims of domestic abuse whose partners or ex-partners had been sentenced to complete the perpetrator programme. And since then, I have then become an accredited IDVA and ISVA manager and also a DA Matters trainer with Safe Lives.
Today, we are going to be looking at the Domestic Abuse Risk Assessment, the DASH-RIC, and we'll also be looking at why and when a DASH-RIC is used, what the best practice is when doing a DASH with a victim of domestic abuse, looking at risk factors of domestic abuse and linking them to the risk assessment, looking at professional judgment and how to use that with victims, and exploring referral pathways and support available for victims and their children. So the DASH-RIC actually stands for Domestic Abuse, Stalking, Harassment, Risk Indicator Checklist, hence why we use the acronym DASH-RIC. And it is about defensible decision making. It helps professionals to understand the risk. It also supports victims to understand their own risk. And it's important that assessing risk of a victim is not a tick box exercise. The DASH helps to put information that the victim gives you into context. And in order to fully understand the risk for a victim, you need to understand the context of the abuse. So the learning aims for today is to increase your understanding of domestic abuse, to help you to understand the DASH-RIC model and how to use it, to support you to identify high-risk victims of domestic abuse, and to support you to feel confident to use professional judgment when risk assessing victims, and also to understand your referral pathways and what support is available in your area for victims.
Throughout this training workshop, we will be talking about the document of the DASH-RIC, Domestic Abuse, Stalking, Harassment, Risk Indicator Checklist. From these slides, you can see that it's a 3-page document, and it is a document comprising of 24 questions. These are all significant questions when thinking about domestic abuse, and we'll talk more about that throughout the training programme. You can find this document on Safe Lives and also on the Dorset For You website.
But first, I want to give a bit of a health warning. It's important to take care of yourself. We don't know what your personal experiences of domestic abuse are, and some of the content of today's session may trigger memories or emotions for you. If that's the case, please do speak to somebody today, be it a friend, a colleague, or a domestic abuse service if you need any support. The other thing is that today we will use language which is our everyday language, such as victim, perpetrator, and we will often refer to the victim as being a she and the perpetrator as being a he. We absolutely understand and recognise that men are also victims of domestic abuse, and we support men who are victims within our services. But for the purpose of today's training, we will use she as a victim and he as a perpetrator. So what is domestic abuse? So the definition of domestic abuse is any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. And that can include coercive control, psychological or emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, economical abuse, harassment, stalking, and digital and online abuse. Anybody can be a victim of domestic abuse. It goes across all cultures, classes, age groups, and genders. There is no stereotypical victim or abuser. And it's really important that we understand that ultimately domestic abuse is about power and control. Abusers or perpetrators of abuse have a sense of entitlement. They do what they do because they can, and they are unlikely to stop their behaviour without intervention from services. We're now going to play a video, and after this video we will have a talk about the content.
I felt like I was going mad. No one else could see what was going on.
I never thought anything like this could happen to me.
Coercive control is a pattern of deliberate abuse, over time leaving the victim intimidated, dependent, and isolated. It can be hard to see, but coercive control is a crime.
He's such a handsome man. When we were first married, he charmed everyone. I felt so lucky. I couldn't put my finger on when it changed. It wasn't one thing he did. It happened bit by bit.
Why are you wearing that dress?
I could never predict what would upset him.
Those heels. I can't stand the sound they make.
From the outside, we look like the perfect couple. A teacher married to a doctor. But inside, I feel like a hostage. He told me who I'm allowed to talk to and who I'm not allowed to talk to. And then he acted like it was all just a joke. It wasn't. He's deadly serious. He gets the kids to tell him who I see and where I go. He told me he'd put hidden cameras in the house to watch me when no one's there.
After I passed my accountancy exams, I had a good salary. But he controlled every penny I spent. He even kept a spreadsheet. In the supermarket, I'd stand in front of the cereals, scared stiff about what he might do if I chose the wrong kind.
He complains that I don't call him enough, then that I call him too much. He gets into my email and deletes things, and he sends messages from my account.
You're a useless mother. You get everything wrong. You're losing it.
The way he undermines me, it makes me doubt myself. What if I make mistakes in front of the class? Is it all in my head?
He'd smash a plate right beside me, and then laugh at me when I flinched. He knew he didn't have to hit me to keep me under control. He'd get angry, then apologise.
You know I love you, but you make me lose my temper. It's your fault.
I thought I'd be safe if I toed the line.
He kept coming to see me at my work, to check up on me. My colleagues thought it was sweet that he was so attentive. He told them,
She needs a lot of attention. She's a wee bit unstable.
I felt too ashamed to tell them what's going on at home. So I left my job. It's like I don't know who I am anymore.
It got so I couldn't go out at all, not even into the garden. He'd hide my medication to punish me. And when his family came round, he acted like husband of the year. I just couldn't bear to tell him the truth. I had no one to talk to.
He says I hurt him. He says he'll kill himself. I feel so guilty. He told me if I ever try to leave him,
I'll cancel your visa. You'll have nowhere to go. You'll bring shame and dishonor on the family. You'll never see the kids again.
I'm trapped. What have I done wrong?
All it took was one person to ask me the right questions. Then I began to open up. I started to see I'm not mad. I started to see the patterns in what he did to me. It's taking a long time to find myself again. Yesterday, someone offered me a cup of tea, and I automatically asked, am I allowed?
Coercive control is against the law. It's a pattern of behaviour that's not obvious at first, but does real damage. And it's a crime.
I wish there was someone I could talk to.
When one person listened to me and believed me, I started to get my life back.
The video itself, although animated, is the words of real victims, and it's important to understand that. Again, domestic abuse is all about power and control. Some figures of domestic abuse for you. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. 1 in 6 men will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. 1 in 4 people from the LGBT community will experience domestic abuse. And 1 in 7 children will experience domestic abuse. And there is 1 incident of domestic abuse that is reported to police every 30 seconds in the UK. And domestic abuse accounts for 1/4 of all violent crime that is reported. You will have seen on the media often reports of women being murdered. In the UK, 2 women are murdered a week by their partner or ex-partner. That's 1 woman who is killed every 4 days. And we know that COVID has definitely increased that figure. There is also high levels of suicide between domestic abuse victims. And although we don't have exact stats for that, more victims of domestic abuse commit suicide than are murdered by their partners. So the death of victims is very high. And over the year, domestic abuse cost the UK economy £66 billion a year. And that includes physical and emotional harm, loss of output from work. It costs the health service, the police, housing and victim services. But it's a huge amount of money. And there needs to be a lot of support and a lot of understanding of what domestic abuse really looks like and how we can support each other to identify victims and to offer support that they need.
The Domestic Abuse Act and Domestic Abuse Bill 2021 received royal assent on the 29th of April. The Act aims to promote awareness of domestic abuse, protect and support victims of domestic abuse, transform the justice response, and improve performance. There will be a new legal definition of domestic abuse and a new National Domestic Abuse Commissioner. The new legal definition will include children as victims in their own right, and financial abuse will be replaced with economic abuse. Local authorities will be required to appoint a local partnership board who will carry out annual needs assessments for accommodation-based support, developing and publishing a strategy. Local authorities will also need to provide support to victims of domestic abuse and their children in accommodation-based support. We already do this in Dorset via You First. There will also be grants to secure tenancies to social tenants where it is connected to domestic abuse. Local authorities will ensure all eligible homeless victims of domestic abuse automatically have a priority need for homelessness assistance. Some other duties included: there'll be new domestic abuse protection orders and notices, special measures to support victims and witnesses of domestic abuse in family courts, not just criminal courts. It will prohibit perpetrators to cross-examine their victims in person in civil and family courts. Dorset Council and other organisations are currently working towards meeting all of these new duties. The following video that you're about to watch is called Harder. It's a short film to help you spot some of the red flags associated with domestic abuse. The second half of the film shows you how all of us can help support those experiencing domestic abuse. Take some time to think about how you may be able to start to implement this kind of practice within your work.
Come on over, Sarah. Hiya. Just get this on you here. There we are. So how you doing, lovely?
Yeah, fine, thanks. How are you?
Oh, doing away, hun. So, just the usual today,
No.
yeah?
No toner. Just a trim, please.
Oh, if you're sure, your colour really could do a wee refresh.
Why would you want to get your hair done? Are you trying to look pretty for other guys?
Sarah?
Sorry, no. No, I'm thinking about growing it out, actually. Maybe go back to my natural colour.
Okay, well, if you're sure. So, you and the fella off anywhere nice this year?
I'm not sure. He's booked to go away with the boys for a week, so depends if he can get more time off.
Bloody cheek. You should be going away with the girls.
Yeah, maybe.
You think you're going anywhere without me? Keep dreaming.
Well, me and James are off to Tenerife. Booked this beautiful, a beautiful 4-star hotel, all inclusive.
Sounds great. Really great.
We know it can be hard to ask,
Where the hell are you?
to speculate on someone's private life,
Let me see your phone, slag.
to make assumptions.
You are worthless.
Hard to jump to conclusions.
You deserve this. You know that, don't you?
We get that's hard. But you know what's harder?
Domestic abuse isn't always easy to spot.
And it can be even harder to talk about.
It's not always bruises, cuts, and cracked teeth.
It's verbal, emotional, sexual, financial.
It's about control and degrading someone's self-worth.
And sometimes it's others you love who get hurt.
As professionals, we're in a unique position to be able to spot the signs of domestic abuse.
By asking questions and offering support,
we can provide a lifeline.
Before the person or situation reaches crisis point.
We know it can be hard to ask when you're busy and unsure of what to do.
But there is a way to reach out and offer help.
AVDR is a simple and effective tool when dealing with suspected domestic abuse. Firstly, ask. Do it sensitively. They may not be ready to talk, but let them know that you're there. Then, validate. Remove blame. Assure them that you believe them and that no matter what has happened, they don't deserve it. Document. Depending on your role within your organisation, you may need to document these details down. Be accurate, using their words, not your own. Describe any injuries in as much detail as possible. Finally, refer. Refer or signpost the appropriate services, for instance, Scottish Women's Aid. Even if someone denies abuse is happening, they may think about your conversation and take action later.
Domestic abuse is real, and it's happening.
It happened yesterday, it's happening today, and it will happen tomorrow.
Everyone's in a position to spot the signs of domestic abuse.
If you think someone is experiencing domestic abuse, reach out. Are you okay?
And if they're not, ask them to call the Scottish Domestic Abuse Helpline.
If you don't ask, who will?
The Dash has been widely used since 2009, and it was originally developed by the Met Police, Safe Lives and Laura Richards, who is a behavioural analyst who worked with New Scotland Yard. And it was implemented across all police services in the UK in 2009. And it turned a reactive, just a domestic approach into a more proactive, you must ask questions approach in order to identify and manage risk within a standardised framework. It's based on 10 years of research and evidence. It wasn't just slung together as a group of questions. The type of evidence they used to create the Dash was data analysts of murders. They looked at 56 domestic homicides. They looked at 450 near misses and 106,000 lower level incidents. They looked at a lot of literature and had consultation with national and international academic experts and practitioners. They put on victim focus groups and debriefs, and there was extensive piloting in several areas throughout the UK on more than 4 occasions, which included evaluations, etc. The Dash was always intended to be used as a multi-agency tool, and that's why we're training you here today. It's not just for police use or domestic abuse practitioners' use. And overall, it fits in with wider public protection, wider safeguarding adults and safeguarding children. And it also profiled offenders and looked at the behaviour of offenders, especially those within murders and those near misses. It has 24 questions, and the police use a slightly different version. Their version has 27. Their version includes 3 extra questions around safeguarding children. But the 24 questions that the standard version uses are based on current and historic behaviours. So the aim of the Dash RIC, ultimately the Dash RIC is about saving lives and preventing harm to victims and their children. And to do this, early intervention is key to reducing that risk and minimising the risk of harm. It looks at who is at risk and who they are at risk from, and it also gives context to behaviours of perpetrators. It covers all aspects of domestic abuse and ensures that no vital information is missed, including coercive control and stalking. The Dash can also be used by frontline practitioners to make decisions about what they should do to safeguard the individual and others. It creates a common language across agencies who work with victims, such as police, health, social care, housing and education. It supports a common referral process to HRDA, and HRDA stands for High Risk Domestic Abuse, and is a local multi-agency, whole family focused meeting where information is shared between agencies to help safeguard the victim and their children. And it also looks to address the behaviour of the abuser. More information on HRDA can be found at dorsetcouncil.gov.uk/HRDA, that's HRDA. So the Dash also looks at current and historic behaviours of the perpetrator, and as perpetrators may have a history of abusing others in a domestic context or other criminal behaviour. Domestic abuse is a serious crime and abusers are often serial offenders. Perpetrators may also be abusing children within the household, and they may go on to abuse others in future. They may also be offending outside the home. Studies have shown that criminality is much higher for those committing violent offences. Often, violence inside the home will often lead to violence outside the home. If you are prepared to hurt the person you're supposed to love and care for, what are you prepared to do to somebody that you have no real feelings for? And when you look at a couple of examples, for instance, Ian Huntley, who sadly murdered Holly and Jessica, the Soham murders, he was a domestic abuse perpetrator. And as was Levi Belfield, who murdered Millie Dowler. He was also a serial domestic abuse perpetrator. And actually, it was one of his previous partners that alerted the police of him in that regard. So it is a really serious offence, and we need to be risk assessing appropriately, which is where the dash comes in. So Laura Richards says that risk identification and assessment is not a predictive process, and there is no existing accurate procedure to calculate or foresee which cases will result in homicide or further assault and harm. Risk is dynamic and changes constantly, and it's really important to think about that when you complete a dash. You are completing a dash and a risk assessment on that day, on the behaviours and the risks on that day, and it could change, the next day or a few days later. Within the dash, there are static risks that will never change, and some that are historical, and again will not change, and it may not be current. There is no way of predicting the future. In DHRs, there have been cases where victims have been standard risks on the dash, or more often not even known to services. They weren't identified as a domestic abuse victim, therefore dash risks were not completed. Risk can escalate at certain times within domestic abuse relationships. We know that leaving is one of those times, and pregnancy and birth of a child. However, we can never predict what will happen. We can only use previous learning to look at protective factors and preventive measures such as safety planning.
Dash is only one part of a larger puzzle, and it should never be used in isolation. Organisational safeguarding policies and procedures must be followed. If there is a risk to anyone, then it must be shared with the relevant authorities. A dash may help in highlighting risks, and it can be shared as a safeguarding concern. Obviously, adhering to information sharing protocols is key. Ensure what you share is relevant. You only share the results of the dash with relevant agencies and with the purpose of keeping the client safe. Dash is a confidential document and should not be shared freely. Clients need to feel safe to share information and know how it is going to be used. Be mindful of multiple complexities. Victims of domestic abuse are overrepresented in substance misuse and mental health communities, so think about the assessments they may also hold and how we can support them with their assessments and their support plans. So we're going to spend some time thinking about when and why could a dash be used. It's really important that you understand that if you receive an initial disclosure of domestic abuse, then you should be completing a dash. When you're thinking about completing the dash, think about the current risks rather than the historical instances, as usually this is how we identify a rapid response to the victim and to their family. If there are changing circumstances, we need to be thinking about reviewing those dashes. Domestic abuse risk is dynamic and it can change very quickly. As and when things change, the risk assessment should be revisited and reviewed. Thinking about domestic abuse as an entirety, don't just think about physical instances. Think about changes in circumstances such as pregnancy or a loss of a job. If there are contributing factors where we believe the risk could increase, it's always much better to complete a dash. Never assume that because you've completed it, that's the risk. Risk can always escalate. We also need to be thinking about the questions. When you're thinking about the questions, don't just ask them, be curious, understand the risk, understand how they're feeling, understand that fear. Why do we complete a dash? So a dash helps us identify high risk. It also gives us context around behaviours. So you look at current and historic. When you're looking at current, you're looking at what are they doing now? Has this behaviour been this way before, or is this a new behaviour? Has there been an increase in how often these behaviours are occurring? What are the trigger points for these risks? What are they thinking about? What is the ultimate goal of the perpetrator? And how does that make the victim feel? The dash enables agencies to make defensible decision makings based on evidence. If it escalates, what else do you need to do within your own agency? You start to think about safeguarding policies and procedures. You start to think about MARIC referrals. Do you need to do a social care referral? Do we need to be speaking to a DA specialist services referral? It starts to help you work out what plan we need to put in place for this victim. It will also help improve decisions when using an evidence-based model, and it increases the likelihood of an appropriate response to the victim. It also allows you to have a discussion with the victim. It allows you to start to understand how they're feeling and for them to start to realise the risk that they could possibly be at. It helps a person living with the abuse to learn more about their life. Often they don't realise it's abuse or that others are also experiencing the same behaviours. You need to be doing this very delicately and sensitively. We do not want to increase the risk if somebody starts to believe that they are then in an abusive relationship. We need to be able to make sure that they manage that in a safe way. We also need to help somebody who is living in an abusive relationship to understand how amazing they are at surviving and living with this intimate terrorism, with this fear and this abuse daily. This is you as a professional and as a practitioner to tell the person that we hear what's happening to them, that we're listening to what's happening to them, we understand their fear, and we're starting to realise what is going on for them on a daily basis. And we can look at different options for them. It will help us understand the strengths of the victim. It will also help us understand their safety plan. How are they safety planning around these different behaviours? What are the trigger points in these behaviours? And how does the victim survive these? This all becomes part of your safety plan for the victim. When we talk about safety planning, the victim is the expert in their safety plan. We are there to facilitate different options. So listen to what they do and how can we build on that safety plan that they already have in place. The dash also shines a light on the behaviour of the abuser. It does not victim blame. It talks about their behaviour, not the victim's behaviour, and it's key that we continue to have that conversation with them. Start to look at support for the perpetrator if it's also appropriate. What is available in Dorset? How can we look at those different support providers where the perpetrator is identifying the behaviour that they are doing is abusive? Now we're going to be talking about best practice when completing the dash, which we've already touched upon on the previous slide. But this is looking about it in more detail. So the dash is not a tick box exercise. It's part of a conversation. Start to understand the questions that we're asking in the dash and why we're asking the questions. Start to understand what we're looking for from the dash and how that can be interpreted. Listen to the victim when they are talking to you and answering questions. How can this be evidenced on the dash? We need to understand what is happening and what has happened, why it's happened, why it is happening, because we want to improve the safety and well-being of them and their victim and their children. When you're talking to a victim, talk to them and explain to them about what the dash means and why you're doing it. Explain to them it's about us being able to help them understand the risk they're at, understanding the different behaviours and how we can support them in their current situation. Answer any questions they may have about it. They may be really nervous, they may be really worried about what's going to happen when they share this information. Try to reassure them, going back to that confidential information. Tell them that people only know about the answers they give if we've got a safeguarding concern. It's really important that when we're getting the answers to these questions, the person speaks to you freely and they're not frightened about what's going to happen. When you're asking a question and when you're asking the dash, where are you doing this? Is it in a confidential space? Do they feel comfortable with their environment? If there's children running around or a child sat next to them watching a programme, is it really the best time to start asking them questions from the dash? If you're sat in a coffee shop, how close are people next to you? If you're sat on a park bench, is there any reason why somebody might overhear? All of these different things you need to be really mindful of. These questions are asking them about their lives, and we need to respect that, and we need to make sure they feel comfortable and they feel able to be able to talk to us about what's happening for them. They're going to feel like we might be judging them, and we need to be doing this in a non-judgmental way. We need to be explaining them that we're doing this for them. When they're answering a question, make sure that they feel safe to answer the questions. And also when they answer the question, validate what they've just said and just go over what they've just said, reaffirming what they've answered. You may be hearing it in one way and they may be saying it in another. So always going back over those questions. You've just explained this to me. Have I got that right? Let me understand what you've just said to me. So you can fully understand what they are actually saying. It shows that you're listening. It shows that you're hearing what they're saying. And it shows that you're interested and that you're taking them seriously. Once you've collected all this information, explain your concerns around their safety. Explain that you want to ensure that you have the full details. Explain to them that if you get the details and you can start to understand the risk, then you hopefully can get them help and support if they want it. It's key to say if they want it. It's not about our needs, it's not about our wants. It's about them and how they want to be supported. It's really important to build a rapport with an individual. Put them at ease. Show empathy. Show encouragement. Never apologise for asking a question. It's really important because as soon as you start to apologise for asking the questions, they'll start to feel sorry for you. And that's not why we're here. We're there to support them and we're there to say to them, we believe you, we know what's going on. Let's talk about this and let's see what we can do to help you. They may be feeling scared, and this could be the first time they've ever spoken about the abuse. So take it at their pace. Try to make sure that they understand that you are listening to them. When speaking to a victim of domestic abuse and you're trying to ascertain the risk, allow the individual to talk. When you speak to them and you allow them to talk freely without interruption, you'll get a lot of the answers from the dash without saying an absolute word. You can always go back and complete questions if you've missed any. This is where your active listening comes in, and this is why they say you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. When thinking about the questions, ask gentle questions, ask neutral questions to encourage the conversation. When they tell you something has happened, ask them what happened next. Show that you're interested. Ask them if they can think of anything else. Talk to them about how that made them feel, how it's making them feel, what are the consequences of any actions that they may take. We also need to be really aware of non-verbal communication. Approximately 70% of what we communicate is by our body language. So look at how they answer a question. How are they sitting? How are they presenting? Do they present differently when you ask them a certain question? Pick up on those things and ask them those things. It's much better to be transparent with somebody and show them that you are understanding what they're going through and that you want to understand what they're going through, so that you can start to understand what is happening. You can start to show them exactly what their options are, and they know that you're not judging them. So when you are completing the form, Here are some just simple things that you need to ensure that you do when you are filling it out. On the front of the page, please make sure that you ensure the victim's name is written clearly on the form along with the date of completion. It's key that we understand that when the date that you've completed it, just in case you do any reviews. Complete each question ticking yes, no or don't know. If you're doing this electronically, the boxes will move. So if the person gives you examples or they give you descriptions or they explain their answers, please put something in here. Allow the victim's voice to be heard in each answer. If you're writing this, try to just pick out the key messages we want to be hearing in that risk assessment. If a victim is unsure, then tick don't know. Be mindful of ticking no unless the victim is very clear. You can always add information if you're not sure. Additional information to each question is key. So where you can and you've been curious and you've asked additional questions, put that detail down there. It helps us understand the current situation that victim is in. Once you've asked all the questions, add them up and you're adding the yeses. The yes answers are the ones that are giving us the indication of risk. On the final page, please complete all the boxes. It gives you questions about are there any additional complexities? Are there any additional information that you need to be aware of? If there is, write it down. Try to not leave any box blank. At the bottom of the form, it's an opportunity for you to write down if you've referred it to Marek, and if yes, brilliant. If no, then give your reasons why. It's then your responsibility to sign and date that document. This is your victim's risk assessment and you are the professional who's filling it in. Please ensure that's completed. When you've completed the form, if you are going to be referring to HERDA or a domestic abuse specialist, ensure that you include the risk assessment. Don't complete just a referral form. Send in your dash. This allows all the professionals to see the risk, to understand the risk, and give the victim's voice a platform of where they are currently.
The dash asks a set of 24 intelligent, researched and evidence questions which are designed to cover the complete range of abuse and risk factors. Physical abuse is always the overarching set of questions, and it looks at both current and historical harm and violence. It also includes another 5 areas of abuse and violence which is identified as characteristic of domestic violence and abusive relationships. So this slide shows the different types of abuse and the questions that it relates to it. So you've got coercion, threats and intimidation, emotional abuse and isolation, sexual abuse, children and pregnancy, and economic abuse. Now, once you have completed a dash with an individual, you will add up the number of yes answers, and this will give you a starting point. Now, it's really important to understand that you cannot really gauge risk by just adding up numbers of ticks. For instance, you could have 2 individuals who both have 9 ticks on a dash, but if one individual's ticks are all based on historic abuse and the other is based on current abuse, the one with the current abuse is obviously at higher risk. So it's really important to understand that it's just a starting point, and you need to really look at the questions and where the risk factors are. Are they current or are they historic? So national practice uses those with 0 to 6 yes answers are standard risk, and that means that there are no significant current indicators of serious harm. And that could potentially mean referrals to support groups, to some safety planning, some short input of outreach support. 7 to 13 ticks means that you would be medium risk. And that it gives is that some indicators of serious harm. That would mean a referral to outreach support, some safety planning, and potentially some input from other agencies, not just domestic abuse agencies. 14 plus ticks would indicate you are high risk and there are identifiable indicators of serious harm. And that would mean a referral to the high risk domestic abuse advisors and to HRDA for a multi-agency response. Again, you have to look at what questions they answer yes to and use professional judgment to understand and to identify what risks are present at the moment. Within the DASH, Rick, there are 15 high-risk questions which indicate the victim could be at high risk of serious harm or abuse. We will look at each of the questions in more detail, but the 15 high-risk factors of serious harm or homicide are victim's extreme fear, coercive control, separation, stalking, escalation, threats to kill, sexual assault, strangulation, pregnancy, child abuse, weapons, community issues and isolation, suicide, homicide, animal abuse, and alcohol abuse, drugs, and mental health. It's really important that we understand that all the questions on the DASH don't carry the same level of risk. If you think about the question around child contact, are there issues regarding child contact? Yes. Do not carry the same risk as the strangulation question. If a victim answers yes to being strangled, then that obviously determines they're a much higher risk. We know that victims of strangulation are 7 times more likely to die because of the nature of that physical abuse. So it's really important that we look at those high risk factors, and we also look at the context of the behaviour. So we understand what the behaviour and context is crucial when identifying risk. It's about joining up the dots, looking at the patterns, the motives and the clusters, looking at the bigger picture about what's happening. And, you know, if you link these behaviours together, that shows a bigger picture, and it's about the holistic approach. And also, if perpetrators have a supercharged sense of entitlement, that i.e. I'm entitled to behave like this, I'm entitled to have these rules, I can do what I like, or if they have a revenge motive against their victims or last resort thinking, i.e. if I can't have you, nobody else will, then the victim is extremely high risk of homicide. So when we look at the victim's extreme fear, it's really important that we listen to victims, because in most cases, victims will underestimate their level of risk from their perpetrator because the behaviour has become normalised to them. And if a victim tells us they are at high risk of harm or homicide, we absolutely must act on that and put interventions in place to protect them and keep them safe. Listen to a victim carefully. They know their perpetrator better than anybody. And also, when we look at domestic homicides, it shows us that victims informed professionals in most cases that they thought they would be killed by their perpetrator. And professionals listened, but they didn't really hear, and they certainly didn't act or put together an appropriate risk management plan. And then if we look at community isolation, isolation is a behaviour used or a tactic used by a perpetrator to exert power and control over their victim. And you will not have coercive controlling behaviour unless you have isolation there. It's all about the victim having to rely on their perpetrator for everything, taking away that victim support network. They want to own their victim. It's all about power and control. They don't want them interacting with others, including professionals at any level. And isolation is key in domestic abuse to gain complete control over someone. But we also look at different ethnic minorities, and they will also be isolated. It could be, you know, think of asylum seekers, older people, people with disabilities, as well as travelling communities or people from the LGBT community. And they are more isolated because in terms of perceived racism or language barriers, culture barriers, insecure immigration status, or they're just unaware of how to access support services. When we think of honour-based violence and forced marriage, communities and families try to restore their mistaken honour and respect, and they will often isolate their victims as well. So we need to be aware that isolation is absolutely key and is a high risk factor in serious harm and homicide. And then we've got separation. Again, separation is a very high risk factor in domestic homicide. Victims who attempt to end or do end an abusive relationship are strongly linked to intimate partner homicide. Many incidents happen, and you know, you will see it in the media. It is the most riskiest time for a victim after she leaves the relationship. Her abuser has lost his power and control and will often go to great lengths to regain it. Once they realise that actually they're not going to get their victim back, they may then start having that last resort thinking and resort to homicide. If I can't have you, nobody else can kind of thought process. On average, victims take around 7 attempts to leave, and will often go back before they finally leave. And it's often that act of finality that the perpetrator realises that is it, they're not coming back, that is the trigger for that homicide. So it's really important, if we've got separation, certainly in the last year, then there is a high risk factor. 76% of domestic abuse homicides occur after separation, and 49% of those occur within the first month, 80% within 6 months. And it is, as I said, that finality, that last resort thinking. So it automatically will always be a high risk factor indicator.
We're now going to play a video about Alice Ruggles. Alice was murdered by her ex-partner in 2016. She was just 24 years old. Her ex-partner was controlling, and when she broke up with him, he stalked and then murdered her. This video shows Alice's family talking about Alice, and also includes the 999 call made by her flatmate, which is quite distressing to hear. We are showing this video as we feel it really important to show the reality of domestic abuse and stalking, and the importance of identifying risk and getting specialist support. If you do not wish to watch the video, please turn off your sound and come back in 5 minutes. Once the video is finished, just take your time to reflect. Alice's ex-partner was convicted of her murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. When you watch the video, it's painful to hear her family's guilt of not understanding the risks or giving the correct advice. If you'd like to find out more information about Alice, there is lots online, and her parents have set up the Alice Ruggles Trust in memory to put an end to stalking.
Try and calm down, try and breathe. Have a shot, just try and... please help me. I know, how old's Alice? She's only 23. I mean, this was coming, and I she's an absolute psychopath.
Alice was one of these people who always had a smile on her face.
She knew the things that were going to make people feel happy.
She always understood what you were thinking, what you were doing. She always knew the right thing to say.
He took her to places.
He bought her presents.
He was trying very hard.
He was a real gentleman.
It didn't seem malicious at the time.
As the relationship moved on, strange things started happening. She started to lose friends.
He used all sorts of things to persuade her she didn't have enough money, she shouldn't go out.
She started to lose weight, she started to lose self-confidence.
She'd had to talk to him constantly. She couldn't wear what she wanted to wear. She could only wear what he thought was appropriate for her to wear.
He was starting to control her. And all the time, what he was doing was gradually making her more and more dependent on him. That was when his controlling behaviour turned to stalking.
She was worried someone had got into her phone and put some spyware on her Android phone. So I talked her through how she could get it all factory reset. And then things started escalating, which was when Trimond turned up at the house.
There was this knock on her window. And when she pulled back the curtains, he was outside and he'd just left a box of chocolates and some flowers on the windowsill and was backing off with his hands like this.
Hi there, I just need a bit of advice really, more than anything. I split up with my boyfriend about 3 months ago. Since then, I know that he's hacked into my Facebook and also my phone. He's been sending me a lot of messages even though I've asked him not to contact me. And then tonight, he knocked on my bedroom window at the back of my ground floor flat. He's been outside and he's like left some flowers and chocolates on the outside windowsill and he walked off. He's not done anything, but I'm concerned and my friends have been telling me to call the police. I've been putting it off, but I just feel a bit shaken up tonight.
On the night, he then sent her a couple of voicemail messages. One of those said in it,
I'm not going to kill you. Why would you think I'll kill you?
I wouldn't kill you.
Although he was talking about it in the negative context, I'm not going to kill you. It was definitely a veiled threat.
When he mentions not killing you about 10 times in this voicemail, which is really weird.
Somebody's been issued with a pen so that they can't contact me. However, I've had a letter off them.
So you're reporting the breach of the pen. What was the nature of it? Was it threatening or was it harassing?
No, not threatening. It's just saying that he knows I called the police on him and he's had everything confiscated. It says at the bottom he won't contact me. This will be the last I hear from him. But he's said that a lot of times and he never does seem to stop.
After that second phone call, she was so depressed because she thought that the stalking was just going to go on forever.
Alice jokingly said, oh, well, what if he broke into my house and killed me? And I was like, no, that'll never happen. As me thinking this is ridiculous.
He came back on the 12th and just a bit after he was waiting in his car and she came back from work.
And then Trimond had come and broken into the house.
Climbed in through a window and he cut her throat in the bathroom.
Alice was lying on the floor in the bathroom, covered in blood.
Alice! Oh my God, she's dead!
When she rang me up, I said, well, I'm sure the police knows what's happening and you've just got to ignore him. If you keep ignoring him, he'll leave you alone. And of course that was really bad advice because he was never going to leave her alone.
I have really struggled remembering because obviously I know what I did wrong and I know what I should have said and I know what I should have done and I know that I failed Alice, so yeah, that's pretty horrible.
If these sorts of things are happening to you, that is stalking. It's a crime. The police have to take it seriously.
The law needs to change so that she does have the protection that she deserved.
I mean, Alice did what she was supposed to do. She did contact the police. She reported everything. In Alice's case, Trimond had past history, a restraining order against him because he'd been stalking another girl. Now, if Alice had known that at the beginning of the relationship, it would have changed whether she'd gone into a relationship with him, and it would definitely have changed how she behaved at the end of it. This is still happening, and we've not learnt from these mistakes.
It's not just that it's psychologically damaging and horrendous, it's very, very dangerous.
Sometimes you may have serious concerns about a victim situation, even though they don't appear to be high risk, or you may have particular concerns about a perpetrator's behaviour. In this instance, you would use professional judgment. So if you have serious concerns, you should always refer to Herder and use your professional judgment. There may be situations where victims refuse to answer the dash questions, or they may only answer a few because they're so upset, or they may just answer no to everything and you have serious concerns. Victims of domestic abuse will minimise and they normalise behaviour because it's the daily abuse is a normal occurrence to them. They could also have extreme levels of fear. There could be cultural barriers, meaning the disclosure is more difficult, such as language issues. And so it may be that you can see the abuse is escalating and there are lots of smaller incidents and that you can see a pattern forming. So in these situations, you would use professional judgment, and confidence and training can create professional judgment. Often the contents of a victim's response to a question alongside more detail of the perpetrator's behaviour is crucial. And it's also useful for the professional to have knowledge around how the risk factors correlate. Again, it's always better to refer if in doubt. Behaviour and risk is not additive. You can't add up a score and come up with a formula. That's unsafe practice and will give a false sense of security. But there's certain things, there could be obsessive stalking behaviours, extreme levels of fear from the victim. There could be a repeat victim of domestic abuse. It could be children are continually witnessing incidents. It could be that the perpetrator has more than one partner that you're aware of. The victim might not be aware of that. Or it could be that there is an increase in the number of call-outs and there's an escalation. Or it could just be that your gut instinct, your experience and knowledge tells you that something is wrong and that somebody may be at high risk of harm. And in these instances, it is much better to make a referral to Herder so that this case can have a multi-agency approach rather than do nothing. So things to think about with a victim of domestic abuse if someone's made a disclosure, alongside onward referrals to specialist services or to Herder. Think about a place of safety for that victim and their children. Do they need an immediate place of safety? Do they need to go to a refuge? Do they have a family or local friends or neighbours? Are there patterns of abuse that can be identified? Is the victim aware of those patterns of abuse? Can they be avoided to minimise any harm? What support networks does the victim have? Do they have neighbours, work colleagues, local friends and families? Do they have important phone numbers for police, for national helplines, for refuge, should they need it? And as well as important documents, national insurance numbers, driving licence, passports, children's passports, birth certificates, all those things are really important that they have to hand. Do they have a charged mobile phone and credit in case they need to use the phone in an emergency? Do they have access to money, to bank accounts? Is there a way they can put some funds aside if need be? What is their profile like on social media? Are they regular users? Could this potentially be used by the perpetrator to continue to kind of stalk or harass them afterwards? Does the perpetrator have access to the passwords to these, as well as email addresses as well, and email accounts? Is the location services on the victim's phone switched off? Can it be tracked by the perpetrator? All these are kind of general safety planning that can be done with victims. However, in-depth safety planning has to be done by a specialist domestic abuse advocate. There are lots of people that have inadvertently and, you know, with all goodwill, completed safety planning with victims and put them at high risk. Because when you put a safety plan in place, there will always be a consequence to that safety plan. For instance, if you advise a victim to block their perpetrator's phone from their mobile or home phone, if that perpetrator can't access them via the telephone, are they likely to come round to that property? If that's the case, then that will ultimately put the victim and her children at higher risk. So there is always a consequence. So please always refer to Domestic Abuse Service for in-depth safety planning. And you should never ever ask a victim of domestic abuse what they would like you to do. That's not an appropriate answer to a victim. You must follow your organisational policy and procedures, and safeguarding. Victims often don't know what they want to do, and we shouldn't be putting that responsibility on them. What to do when you've completed the dash. Obviously, all high-risk cases must go to HERDA. Follow your organisational policies and procedures around safeguarding. It may mean you need to make a safeguarding referral to adult services or children's services. What's really important is you speak to the victim. Don't take that control away from the victim and dictate what will happen. Speak to the victim, give them options, explain the procedures. We want them to work with us, and refer to specialist services. Talk to the victim about what a specialist service is and how we are independent from the local authority, from police, and that we will support them in any way that they want. Often victims won't engage with a specialist service because they don't really understand what the service does and how they can help them. So it's really important, if you're taking a disclosure, that you explain that to the victim and they know that they're going to be contacted and that whoever contacts them is a safe organisation for them to work with.
What help is available for victims of domestic abuse? We have specialist domestic abuse services in Dorset. These specialist domestic abuse services provide practical and emotional support to victims. As part of our assessment and as part of our support, we risk assess, and we risk assess regularly. We complete the DASH, the S-DASH and the HBV DASH. We are there to explain their options and to support them in their own choices. For example, they may wish to stay in a relationship, so we support them to remain as safe as possible by recognising the risks, understanding the triggers, and by safety planning. We also support them to understand and recognise the abuse, to realise that it isn't their fault. As we've discussed earlier, safety planning is key. We build on a victim's safety plan that they have put in place already. We look at their options. We discuss consequences to different options. We discuss what would the consequence be if you did this action in your safety plan. Does the safety plan increase their risk? If it does, we need to understand that so we can support them in this. When we're thinking about legal options and legal orders, we may support them in police, and we may look at getting restraining orders and supporting them with domestic violence protection orders and notices, supporting them attending court hearings, taking statements, liaising with the Crown Prosecution Service. In addition, we will also look at civil orders. So this could include a non-molestation order and also an occupation order. And we work really closely with the victim and any solicitors who may be in support, looking at legal aid or legal help. Or if they're not entitled to that, then we look at how they can obtain an order themselves in their own right. We'll also work with them when dealing with social services, and that's adult services and children's services. We will attend child protection meetings or child in need meetings if required. We'll provide reports. But we are there as the voice of the victim. We are there to support the victim. Target hardening is a key part of somebody's safety plan, and we will be able to provide target hardening, which means window alarms, door wedges, looking at chains on doors. We also work with our partner agencies within housing associations about how they can maybe make a property safer. We look at even chopping down a tree, or reducing visibility into a property, or obtaining garden CCTV that has night vision if somebody is being stalked and they live in a rural community, as we most do in Dorset. We also have refuge spaces. Our refuge spaces are very different across the county. We have self-contained units where somebody will have their own flat within a supported accommodation, and we also have shared accommodation where people share facilities. These services are not 24/7, although our helpline is 24/7, and each refuge client will get a key worker, have support around them for their children to hopefully help them move on to independent living, where they can be as free from fear as we can get them. There's also support for children. There are children and young person domestic abuse advocates. They look at the trauma they've experienced and how they can keep themselves safe. They're not therapists, and they work really closely with schools and with other possible agencies that are working with those children. We also have recovery groups. Recovery groups look at behaviours of the perpetrator. They look at how that may have impacted on somebody's coping mechanisms and how they can recognise the signs moving forward. This also allows them to be with other people who have experienced domestic abuse and that they're not on their own. And we find this a very, very good way of somebody coming to an end of their journey, where they are managing their risks, they are able to understand their risks, they've had one-to-one support, and they want a better understanding. You first have also got counselling. This is targeted at domestic abuse that they've experienced. It is not a wider sense of counselling, as we recognise that there was a need for bespoke domestic abuse counselling. We also have specialist advocates that work alongside the police. We have health advocates in the hospital, and there are also domestic abuse advocates within the police who work with high-risk victims who are then heard at HERDA. We're now going to be discussing the referral pathways for victims. So, high-risk victims of domestic abuse. If you've completed a DASH and they have scored 14 or more ticks on the DASH risk assessment, or your professional judgment is indicating that they're at high risk, or there's been an escalation in risk or repeat incident in the last 12 months, then you need to refer to HERDA. And you need to do this by completing the referral form with a completed DASH attached to it. I would also be suggesting that you follow your organisational safeguarding procedure, and if there are any children or vulnerable adults within the household, consider making a safeguarding children or adults referral to the MASH or to the adult safeguarding triage team. Medium risk victims pathway is for those who you have completed a DASH and they are scoring 9 to 13 yeses. For this, you need to obtain the consent from the person, and you can refer them if they consent, or signpost them to you first, as it is really important that the person has access to support, but they also agree to support. You can see our website on there, or we do have an 0800 number, which is 0800 032 5204. Standard risk victims are those who are scoring 8 yeses or lower on the dash. If they require support, then you'll need to obtain consent from the victim to make a referral or to signpost to victim support. As again, we believe it's important that a person has access to support. There is also a telephone number that they can contact, or you can contact as a professional. It's 0808 16 89 111. Now we're going to look at the referral pathway for refuge. Refuge should be seen as the last resort for any individual and family. All options should be considered when working with a victim. What do they want to do? Where do they want to live right at this very moment? Can a non-molestation order or an occupation order be considered to keep them in their home or within their community if it's safe to do so? Has a restraining order been requested with the police if there is a criminal investigation? What are the consequences of someone moving into refuge if they leave their support network in their community? If all of these items have been discussed and explored with the victim and refuge is felt to be the safest option for that individual, as a professional, there are several options you have. You can either contact Dorset Housing, who will be able to help you and they will look at your options. You can also contact You First, who provide refuge in Dorset, Somerset, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, and you can contact them on their 0800 number and they can also then look at spaces available for you. Or you can contact the National Helpline, who will provide you with organisations who have spaces available. These numbers can also be given to the client who may not be ready to flee their home at that time, but they've then got the numbers available when they do want to leave and they can make contact with these services. It's really important to note that refuge is not free. To support somebody in a refuge, they need to be eligible for housing benefit. If they have no recourse to public funds, then we need to look at different options for them to make sure that they are living somewhere that they are able to either afford, or whether they have an organisation to support them, or whether they have a specific refuge who is able to take somebody with no recourse. We're just going to talk about a few facts and figures from Dorset. As you can see from the slide, between 2019 and 2020, You First received 1,207 referrals for support. The following year, between 2020 and 2021, You First saw an increase of referrals and inquiries into the service of 87%, which is obviously huge. And we worked with all of our partner agencies to ensure that anybody coming into our service or anybody requesting advice and support was able to receive the appropriate support required. And in Dorset, between 2019 and 2020, Dorset Police recorded 2,422 incidents of domestic abuse. So it is happening in our county, it is prevalent within our communities, and we need to start having those conversations. The majority of referrals coming into You First have been female victims with male perpetrators, but we do recognise and we do support male victims in their own right and those from same-sex relationships and also those experiencing domestic abuse from the family member. The average ages of victims coming into our service have been between 27 and 35 years old. However, we have seen an increase in older people who have disclosed domestic abuse. And the work that we do with them looks slightly different because sometimes it will be a child to parent or they've been experienced abuse for a much longer period of time. Additionally, our services work with communities to reach isolated communities such as older people, those from the BAME or LGBTQ communities, those who have a learning disability, those who are from rural locations who can't access support from those who may be working in a town or living in a town, and for men. And we do this work in our communities to highlight domestic abuse so that victims are able to seek support and they know where to go. So if you do need support, remember our numbers. It's 0800 032 5204.
Hi, my name's Tonya and I work at the UTrust with Katie, and I'm joining just for this slide and we're looking at some frequently asked questions. So our first question there is, when do I complete the dash? I always say you complete it the first time you meet somebody and they disclose they're experiencing domestic abuse. and you complete it if there's been another incident of domestic abuse. That's your two main times. And Katie, there's a third that you wanted to talk about.
So when you think about the high risk factors we talked about earlier within the presentation, go back to your notes, and also if there's been a change in circumstance. So think about pregnancy, has somebody lost their job, has there been a change that could escalate that risk? So you start to think outside the box rather than thinking just a physical incident of domestic abuse.
Yeah, really good point. So any change at all that someone talks to you about.
Yes.
So the form's quite long, people are saying, Katie. What do you think about it? Can it be shortened? Any specific questions?
This form has been created with specific questions around domestic abuse to be able to evaluate risk, so it can't really be shortened. But what we would be advising you, as when you start to get more confident with the questions, you can start to ask those questions in conversation, so it doesn't feel as onerous asking specific questions all the time. You know, again, go back to your high risk factors, thinking about which questions are maybe more significant to identify high risk situations, but you do need to ask all 24 questions to give you an excellent way of looking at that risk that person's at.
Yeah, I agree. And I know when I started, I had a crib sheet with the high risk questions on, just that I could keep looking at them and making sure that if someone was talking to me, I was just kind of ticking off mentally that they'd already answered those bits. So I didn't re-ask something, because I think there's nothing worse than being asked the same question you just told people about. And I agree. Once people get used to it, that conversation just flows, doesn't it?
Yeah. And there, like you say, there are questions on there that will never change. So have they got a previous record of, you know, domestic abuse and other offences? That will always be the same.
Yes.
So there are some questions when you're reviewing the dash that you won't have to ask again, but there are others that you will always need to re-ask.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, thanks. So the next one, Kate, why do I need to do it? Why don't you first just do it?
Domestic abuse is a safeguarding issue. It is everyone's business, as Tonya will explain in a moment. You know, and if you get a disclosure, for somebody to disclose to you that they've experienced domestic abuse is a massive thing for them. You know, and if you get that disclosure, you need to act on it, and you need to be supportive of that victim, and you need to be supporting them through their journey. You're their first disclosure, and therefore they've built that trust up to tell you that, and therefore it is your business to take action.
I totally agree, Katie. We are a small team in Dorset, and I think everyone needs to be mindful of just the resource we've got and how precious that resource is for all of us. And if we all do our bit and we help each other and work in partnership, it's so much better. So yeah, I do say that domestic abuse is everyone's business. If it's not the adult you might be working with, it could be the children, it could be other family members who are supporting. So yeah, we need everyone to step up and do it, hence this training. Specific tool, Katie, to help young persons' relationships.
There's a children and young persons dash, which has been designed with young people by Safe Lives. It's for young people aged 13 to 19. And so it's the same questions, but asked slightly differently. And the order is slightly changed.
Yeah.
And that was because some young people didn't actually understand what the questions were. So you can find that on Safe Lives website and get to know what those questions look like if you are specifically working with younger people who may disclose some form of domestic abuse.
Yeah, there's lots of tools out there. Safe Lives website has to be your go-to place. It's such a great resource. They've been very generous in all their resources and sharing. There's lots of stuff on there. And not only do you get the tool, you get the form to complete, you get all the information behind it that tells you why you're completing the question and what else it links with, and what you can hope to get from it. So please use those tools. So someone also has asked about assessing risk at 13 below and referring to HERDA if they're worried that person is still at high risk. Very easy for me, it's a yes, but I know Katie wants to go into that just a little bit more. But yes, if someone's below the threshold, but you've got concerns, refer them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about in the in the training earlier about 14 and over is high risk, it automatically goes to HERDA. But actually we also talk about professional judgment. So again, think about those high risk factors, those change of circumstances. using your gut instinct. You know, the questions are there to help a conversation. You may get more information from those questions that are not actually there on the questions, and that's what those extra boxes are at the end of the dash, to help you give your evidence of professional judgment. It then supports the chair and also the group around sat at the herder to start to formulate an action plan and a support plan. So as much information that you can give to give reasons why you're putting it to herder if it's under the score of 14 just helps us to understand the reasonings behind it.
Yeah. And that point, can't emphasize that enough, because the chair at herder does not know the family or the young person. You do. And so the more information you can give in there and say why that thought, why you're not happy, why you think it's high risk is really, really important, like Katie says, because if you don't fill that in, actually the chair and the people in that team, in that group, as they're having that meeting, are quite blind, if you like. They haven't got the resources and the information to them. So yeah, fill it in. Thanks, Katie. So someone's asked about where they can go if they need more information. My mantra is go to Save Lives. Brilliant. I've already said that. I'm going to Save Lives website. We can give you more information on our website. And Katie, you also know some local resources.
Yeah, locally, you know, you go to your Dorset's website. They've got lots of information there under the domestic abuse tab. Also, utilise your support network within your colleagues, you know, and follow your safeguarding procedure as well if you've got those concerns. And you can also, when you go to the Dorset Council and Domestic Abuse Service website, you can then see the link to herder. So all of those resources are actually there. So it's a really important tool for you to be able to find all the right forms, referral forms, everything like that is on the Dorset Council website.
And the last question kind of links with that, saying if I get stuck completing a dash, is there any support? Katie will say to you that my biggest 3 words are brain, body, boss. If your own brain, go to your own brain first, so your own resources, your training notes, what you've reread your training notes, go back onto this training, look at what else, because sometimes we go to a training and we forget what's going on. So review all your notes, go onto the website. The next one is body. You've got colleagues, go to your colleagues that have attended the training, maybe speak to your manager, you know, speak to all your own resources first. And then if you can't find what you want, give us a shout. We're really happy to help. But please use your own resources first, because that's why you've come to this training, so that you can be skilled and be given the resources to be able to complete a dash. And so if you just ignore that, it kind of defeats the object of the training. Katie, do you want to add to that?
I guess I just wanted to say also use your, you know, your safeguarding leads. Find out who are your point of contacts in Dorset Council for domestic abuse. You know, because there are certain people who have got experience and work very closely with us and other partners around domestic abuse and herder. So you do have a lot of resources by people in Dorset Council to support you in your practice around domestic abuse. So do think about those and utilising those as well.
Well, that's the end of your frequently asked questions. So I hope this additional slide, or this end slide, was useful for you. And I'm going to say goodbye, and it's been lovely to be part of this training.
Thank you very much, everyone. And that's the end of our training now. So thank you. And, you know, if you need any more support, do come to you first and we can provide you more advice.